Welcome to silent revenge, where the ones you trust the most can become your worst enemies. I never imagined my own father-in-law could betray me in a single moment, and yet he did. What he said about my family wasn't just cruel, it was the spark that lit a fire I never knew I had. I still remember the exact moment my world cracked open. My name is Ethan Harper, a man who believed family meant loyalty, that blood ties could withstand anything. I had worked hard, built a stable life with my wife Grace, and our 10-year-old son Lucas. Our home in suburban Virginia was modest but warm. Love to me was the currency that mattered, not money, not status. I thought we had everything we needed. Lucas was the light of my life. He had this way of smiling that could make any bad day vanish. And yet, he was also the one who came to me with news that shattered the foundation of everything I trusted. "Dad," he whispered one evening, his small hands gripping mine. "Grandpa voted you out of the board meeting today." He said our family wasn't refined enough. The words didn't just sting. They detonated inside me. I remember laughing at first, trying to mask the humiliation. Surely, Lucas was exaggerating. Surely my father-in-law, Richard Caldwell, a man I had once respected, wouldn't betray me in such a public, degrading way. But the look on my son's face, the way his eyes brimmed with tears, told me otherwise. Richard was a titan in our community, a wealthy, influential man who had built a family empire. And I had been naive enough to think his respect for me came from who I was, not what I could offer. His words were a scalpel, cutting through every ounce of pride I had left. I paced the kitchen, replaying the scenario over and over. How could a man who called me family treat me like an outsider? How could he dismiss everything I had contributed to the business, to the legacy, just because my manners weren't polished enough for his taste? It wasn't just about being voted out. It was about humiliation, about betrayal, about a father-in-law teaching my son that my family was inferior. My blood boiled with a mixture of grief, rage, and a chilling clarity. If I didn't act, I would lose more than respect. I would lose my identity in the eyes of the person I loved most, my son. And at that moment, as Lucas clung to me, I made a decision. I would not let this betrayal define us. I would not crumble quietly under the weight of Richard Caldwell's contempt. There was a reckoning coming, calculated, precise, and devastating. Sometimes the deepest pain births the sharpest focus, and mine had just begun. The next morning I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. Every corner of my house felt smaller, suffocating, like Richard's judgment had seeped into the walls. I sat at the kitchen table, Lucas beside me, doodling quietly, unaware of the storm raging in my head. That boy had a wisdom beyond his age, though, and he finally broke the silence. "Dad," he laughed, didn't he? Lucas's voice was barely audible, but it cut me deeper than any insult. I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles turned white. "Yes," I muttered. He laughed. It wasn't just a laugh, it was the kind that confirms power. The kind that says, "You're nothing. You'll never belong here." And he had said it to my son, in front of the board, in front of colleagues I trusted. I could feel every eye that had witnessed my humiliation replaying in my mind. I wanted to call him, scream, demand an explanation. But even as rage burned through me, I realized confrontation would be naive. Richard was a master at manipulation. He thrived on control. Any impulsive move would only play into his hands. My anger needed direction, it needed strategy. Later that day, I went through the meeting minutes that Lucas had secretly brought me. My heart sank as I read Richard's words, not just dismissive, but maliciously calculated. He had questioned my capabilities, subtly undermining every suggestion I'd made over the past year. And then, the final blow. The Harper family lacks the refinement and decorum suitable for the board's future vision. He didn't even mince words. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was public, permanent, and humiliating. My own blood, my son, had to hear it, had to see me diminished. And I realized something terrifying. Richard didn't just want to control the company. He wanted to rewrite our family narrative to make Lucas believe we were lesser. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, a cold clarity creeping through me. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. And if I wanted my son to respect me, if I wanted him to see the truth, I had to respond, but not like a man blinded by rage. I had to be smarter. I had to be patient. That night, I sat alone in my office, the house silent. I stared at the photo of my family on my desk, the perfect image of love and trust. And I promised myself something I had never imagined: Richard Caldwell would regret underestimating me. And Lucas, he would never see me as powerless again. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Lucas slept peacefully beside Grace, blissfully unaware of the storm I carried. My mind wouldn't stop replaying Richard's smirk, the way he leaned back in that leather chair, confident, untouchable. The humiliation was raw, a burn I couldn't shake. I felt small, powerless, but beneath it, a flicker of something darker began to grow, a determination. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I wasn't weak, but the truth was, I was unraveling. I questioned everything. Had I misjudged the people around me? Was Grace in on his subtle manipulations, or had she, too, been blinded by his charm? Even Lucas's innocent trust made me feel like a failure. A father should protect, but how could I shield him from a man like Richard Caldwell? I began obsessing over every interaction, every meeting, every word Richard had ever spoken to me. His praise had always carried an undertone of superiority, a constant reminder that in his eyes, I would always fall short. And yet, the thought that gnawed at me most was his influence on my son. Lucas looked at me with admiration, and I realized how fragile that trust was. One more incident like today, and his view of me would be colored forever. Anger alone wouldn't suffice. I felt a sick twist of anxiety every time I imagined confronting Richard, every time I imagined failing again. The more I reflected, the more the betrayal felt like a trap I had stumbled into, a trap set for my ego, my career, my family. I hated him, but I also feared him, and that fear became a mirror showing me my own inadequacies. I couldn't talk to Grace. She was too kind, too trusting. She would have begged me to forgive, to let it go. But forgiveness wasn't an option, not when my family's dignity was at stake. I had to wrestle with my feelings alone: rage, humiliation, fear, and the sharp clarity that came only when pain is distilled into purpose. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, I had made a silent vow. I would not let Richard define my worth. I would not let Lucas see me as a man diminished by another's arrogance. And yet the question remained, how do you plan revenge on a man who sees you as nothing, when every move you make could be turned against you? For days, I moved through my life like a ghost, smiling, nodding, attending meetings, all while my mind spun relentlessly. Revenge wasn't about rage, it was about precision. I couldn't afford mistakes. Richard Caldwell thrived on underestimating people, and I planned to exploit that. Every misstep I'd ever made, every laugh he had ever thrown my way, I cataloged meticulously. I had to turn his arrogance against him. I started small. I studied his routines, the way he interacted with board members, the subtle cues he gave when manipulating others. I took mental notes of his social circle, the allies he leaned on, and the insecurities he masked behind wealth and charm. Everything I learned became a piece of a chessboard, and I positioned myself carefully, waiting for the perfect opening. Lucas's words echoed in my mind, constantly. Dead. He laughed, didn't he? That innocent observation became my fuel. I realized this wasn't just about me, it was about the narrative being written for my son. If I lost, Lucas would grow up believing power belonged to those willing to humiliate and dominate. That thought alone hardened my resolve. I also reflected on my own resources. I wasn't wealthy like Richard, but I had influence, skills, and an understanding of human nature he often ignored. I could navigate the gaps he overlooked, exploit the overconfidence that had always been his armor. It would require patience, manipulation, and psychological insight. I needed him to believe he was still untouchable. While I quietly dismantled his control from within, I drew up scenarios in my mind, rehearsing conversations, predicting his reactions. Every decision had to be surgical, subtle enough to evade suspicion, impactful enough to cut deep. I reminded myself that the goal wasn't just to win against Richard, it was to reclaim dignity, to teach my son that cunning and patience could overcome arrogance. But as I sat in the dim glow of my office late at night, a nagging thought pricked at the edge of my confidence. What if I miscalculated? What if my carefully plotted moves only exposed me further? The risk was enormous, but the cost of inaction was even higher. I made a decision, then I would act, but cautiously. Each step would be deliberate, each move intentional. This was no longer a game of emotion. It was strategy, patience, and psychological warfare. The first move had to be invisible. I couldn't confront Richard Caldwell directly. That would be suicide. So I started subtly inserting small doubts where no one would suspect me. I whispered questions to board members, planting seeds about decisions he'd made, highlighting inconsistencies, all under the guise of concern for the company's future. Nobody suspected me yet. I watched him carefully during meetings. The arrogance, the smirk, the way he dominated every conversation. It was a predictable rhythm, and rhythms can be disrupted. I tested small, calculated provocations, nudging his ego, letting him overreach just enough to create cracks in his facade. Each overreaction, each subtle slip, became ammunition for the next phase. At home, I reinforced my narrative for Lucas, carefully demonstrating competence, composure, and decisiveness. I wanted him to see a father who wouldn't crumble under betrayal. Sometimes, I said quietly one evening, you have to let people think they're winning until it's too late. Lucas didn't fully understand, but I knew the lesson would sink in. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. A casual board dinner, Richard's element. I had secured an invitation under the pretense of discussing upcoming company initiatives. I arrived with grace, composed, polite, unassuming, while every detail in my mind ticked like a clock counting down to opportunity. Richard noticed me immediately, a smirk curling his lips. "Ethan," he said, voice dripping with mock warmth, "glad you could join us." I smiled, calm, silent. I let him have the spotlight, letting him parade his influence. And I observed. The board was watching, colleagues subtly shifting under his dominance. Everyone unknowingly primed for disruption. I made mental notes, mapping exactly how his arrogance would betray him in front of them. Small things, missed cues, slightly exaggerated claims, reminders of past errors, were sprinkled into conversation, all delivered so innocently that Richard didn't sense the trap tightening. By the end of the night, I could feel the tension building in the room, like a storm waiting for release. His overconfidence was blinding him. He didn't see the setup, didn't see me orchestrating it all from the shadows. As we left, Richard clapped me on the shoulder, laughing lightly. "You're learning, Ethan. Maybe one day you'll keep up." I nodded, hiding the satisfaction thrumming through me. He had no idea. The cracks I had planted began to widen faster than I expected. Board members started questioning Richard subtly, nudging him into defensive stances I had anticipated. His confidence, once unshakable, wavered in microseconds I could exploit. Every slight hesitation, every clipped response felt like a victory. But I knew this was only the beginning. At home, I maintained the calm mask. Lucas noticed my sharper focus, my late nights, the way I scribbled notes into a leather-bound journal no one else could read. He didn't ask questions, just watched. And that was enough. I realized revenge wasn't just about dismantling Richard. It was about reclaiming my son's admiration and trust, proving to him that justice could be earned through patience and intellect. I started amplifying the narrative externally. I discreetly shared data with a few influential colleagues, subtly highlighting decisions Richard had made that could reflect poorly on him. Nothing overt, nothing traceable to me, just carefully positioned facts, like a chess player sacrificing pawns to corner a king. I watched as whispers spread quietly, but their impact was undeniable. Richard began noticing the shifts. I could see it in the way he reacted to emails, in the tension when he spoke to certain board members. He tried to assert control, but every attempt exposed another flaw, another vulnerability I had anticipated. He was like a predator who had suddenly discovered invisible traps under his feet, clumsy, frustrated, and visibly rattled. One evening, as I left the office later than usual, I caught him speaking to a colleague, his voice sharp, almost desperate. "Something's going on," he hissed. "I don't know who's undermining me, but it's deliberate." I smiled faintly in the darkness, knowing the realization was dawning too late. The pieces were moving according to my design. Even Grace noticed a change in him during social events. The aura of invincibility he had always worn like armor was cracking. I felt a quiet satisfaction, but I reminded myself escalation was dangerous. The more he felt threatened, the more reckless he would become. That recklessness was exactly what I needed. The reckoning began quietly. Richard Caldwell, once untouchable, now moved through the boardroom like a man on thin ice. His authority had been chipped away so subtly that no one could pinpoint the source, but everyone felt it. Colleagues whispered, glanced, and hesitated before following his commands. The air he once dominated was now charged with tension. I watched from my corner during the weekly board meeting, heart pounding but face calm. He tried to assert control, his voice clipped, sharp, but the usual deference had vanished. Every word he spoke was met with hesitation or veiled challenge. His smirk, once smug and infallible, faltered. And in those moments, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a vindication that went far beyond professional victory. Lucas's face flashed in my mind. The betrayal had started with him hearing my humiliation, and now, in a sense, I was proving to him that injustice could be met with intelligence, patience, and resolve. Revenge wasn't just about humiliation. It was about restoring dignity, showing him the power of strategy over brute force. Richard's desperation grew with each passing day. He reached out to former allies, trying to rally support, but the seeds of doubt I had planted had already taken root. Some hesitated, some silently agreed with the whispers I had carefully set in motion. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was fraying at the edges, and I felt a dark thrill knowing it wasn't me, not directly. It was his own arrogance that was undoing him. Even at home, the tension had shifted. Grace noticed the change in our conversations with him. Lucas started asking questions, subtle but curious, about fairness, respect, and power. I realized that what had begun as personal humiliation had evolved into a lesson for my family. The man who once taught my son to see us as inferior was now revealing his own weaknesses, unintentionally. But the danger wasn't gone. Richard's next move would be unpredictable. The longer the power shift continued, the more reckless he would become. I had to remain vigilant, ensuring every action was precise, every reaction calculated. One misstep could ruin everything I had worked for, not just my revenge, but my family's sense of justice and security. The day of reckoning arrived without warning. Richard Caldwell stormed into the boardroom, red-faced and trembling with barely contained rage. He thought he was confronting an invisible enemy, but the trap I had laid was airtight. Every ally he had hoped would defend him now questioned his judgment openly, subtly, publicly. Every word he spat in anger only revealed the cracks I had carefully nurtured over months. I sat quietly, observing him unravel. The man who had humiliated me in front of my son, who had made Lucas believe my family was inferior, now faced the consequences of his own hubris. He tried to reassert control, but the board no longer listened blindly. Emails, memos, and small seeds of doubt I had planted earlier now surged like a tide against him. By the end of the meeting, it was undeniable Richard had lost. His authority, once absolute, had crumbled piece by piece, without me having to lift a hand. I didn't celebrate, at least not outwardly. Revenge had never been about joy, it had been about justice, about dignity restored. I looked at Lucas across the table. His eyes met mine, wide with awe and understanding. In that moment, he saw his father not as someone defeated, but as someone who had quietly, deliberately turned betrayal into triumph. That was the lesson I had wanted him to learn. Power doesn't always belong to the cruel. It belongs to the patient, the observant, the smart. Richard left the room that day a different man. Silent, defeated, and stripped of the image he had so meticulously curated. I knew he would recover eventually, but he would never again underestimate me or my family. And as I walked out of the office with Lucas and Grace by my side, I felt a weight lift. It wasn't revenge for the sake of spite. It was the reclamation of our dignity, the restoration of trust between father and son, husband and wife. I had transformed humiliation into strength, betrayal into clarity. Moral reflection, true revenge is less about destruction and more about restoring balance. Those who betray and belittle often fall by their own arrogance, while the patient strikes silently and reclaim their power. If you connected with this story, please like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps Silent Revenge continue sharing these powerful stories. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because in every shadow of betrayal, there's a story waiting to turn the tables.